"You're not getting a seat at the table this year," my mom said as she slid my brother his new car keys over Thanksgiving dinner. All because I refused to cover his $60,000 student loan debt. I just smiled, set down my fork, and walked out. The next morning, they woke up to a locked garage and a repossession notice, and then I never thought my parents could be so selfish. Not to this extent. Sure, they'd always favored my sister, Claire, and doted on my younger brother, Ethan, but I didn't think they'd put me on the spot like this. Not on Thanksgiving, and definitely not in front of the entire family. Dinner was in full swing, the table heavy with perfectly roasted turkey, buttery mashed potatoes, and cranberry sauce that still had the faint ridges from the can. My mom had gone all out, as usual, every detail screaming. Perfect family holiday. I should have known better. About halfway through the meal, just as my Uncle Mike was telling some long-winded story about his fishing trip, my mom cleared her throat. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a shiny set of car keys. I watched her eyes flick to Ethan, who was busy trying to cut through an overly dry slice of turkey. "For our son," she said, holding the keys up for everyone to see, the polished metal catching the soft glow of the chandelier. "The one with a bright future ahead." Ethan looked up, his fork hovering awkwardly midair. My sister, Claire, leaned back in her chair, already smirking. My dad topped off his wine glass, suddenly very focused on the bottle's label. I felt the eyes of half the table swing in my direction, the unspoken comparison hanging thick in the air. My mom set the keys down in front of Ethan, whose face turned a deep shade of red. He looked at me, clearly uncomfortable. He hadn't asked for this, I knew that. He's 20, a college kid just trying to figure out life. He's not the problem. But my mom wasn't done. "You're not getting a seat at the table this year," she said, her tone sharp, deliberate. "Not after you refused to help your brother out." The room went dead silent, the only sound the soft clink of my uncle's fork as it hit his plate. I felt the blood rush to my face. I didn't need to ask what she meant. A few months back, my parents had casually mentioned that they expected me to cover Ethan's $60,000 student loan debt. Just because I had a steady job, had paid off my own loans, and bought my first house. Just because I had finally managed to crawl out of the financial quicksand of my 20s. When I told them no, that I couldn't and wouldn't take on that kind of burden, my mom had gone cold. My dad had muttered something about family loyalty, and my sister had just smirked like she was watching a TV drama unfold. But this was a new low. Ethan's face had turned a painful shade of pink. I could see the panic in his eyes. He hadn't asked for any of this. My dad kept his eyes on his plate, swirling his wine like the answer might be hidden in the glass. Claire just crossed her arms, clearly enjoying the show. I glanced around the table. My Aunt Linda shifted uncomfortably, my cousin Sam shot me a sympathetic glance, and my grandfather just shook his head slowly, disappointment etched into his lined face. Uncle Mike, always the loudest voice in any room, finally broke the silence. "Now hold on," he said, setting his fork down with a clatter. "That's not fair. Jack's not responsible for anyone else's debt." My mom shot him a withering look, her eyes narrowing as she prepared to fire back. "Family is supposed to support each other," she said, her voice tightening. "That's what this is about." I felt the heat rising in my chest, the kind that makes your pulse pound in your ears. I pushed my chair back slowly, the legs scraping against the polished wood floor. I looked at Ethan, gave him a small nod, just enough to let him know it wasn't his fault, then turned and walked out of the room. I didn't slam the door. I didn't say a word. I just left, the cold November air hitting me as I stepped outside, my breath coming in sharp, angry clouds. That night I barely slept. I kept running the moment over and over in my head, each replay making me angrier. I thought about all the years I'd put my family first, all the sacrifices, the late nights, the holidays missed because of work, and this was how they repaid me. By trying to publicly shame me into footing a $60,000 bill. By morning, I was done being their safety net. I made a few calls, pulled a few strings, and by the time my parents woke up, Their world had started to unravel. The garage door wouldn't budge, a thick, official-looking notice slapped across it in bright red letters. Seized property. They didn't even realize their car insurance had been frozen until my mom tried to call the dealership in a panic. I could picture the scene in my head, my mom in her robe, standing in the cold garage, her phone pressed to her ear, struggling to make sense of the chaos. My dad, still half asleep, fumbling with the remote, trying to get the door to budge, and Claire's confused, irritated voice in the background. It was just the beginning. I expected the phone calls to start early, but it took until just past noon for my mother's number to light up my screen. I let it ring. She called again, and then my dad back to back, each call shorter and angrier than the last. I finally picked up on the fifth attempt, more out of curiosity than anything else. "Jack, what is going on?" My mother snapped, her voice high and strained. "Why is our garage locked? Why are our accounts frozen? Is this some kind of sick joke?" I leaned back, stretching my legs out on my small, second-hand couch, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a well-laid plan unfolding. "It's not a joke, Mom. It's business," she sputtered, caught off guard. "Business? Your family. You can't just..." I cut her off. "Funny, I thought family meant mutual respect. Not trying to publicly humiliate your son in front of everyone. Not treating me like an ATM just because I managed to get my life together." There was a long pause. I could hear my dad in the background, his muffled, confused questions only adding to the chaos on their end. My mom, ever the control freak, must have motioned for him to stay quiet, because she came back to the phone a moment later, her voice tighter but a little more controlled. "Jack, this isn't the way to handle things. You've taken it too far." I almost laughed. Too far? After years of bending over backward for them, after that Thanksgiving stunt, this was what she considered too far? I took a deep breath, forcing my tone to stay even. "Mom, you wanted to teach me a lesson at dinner, right? About loyalty and support? Well, consider this my lesson to you. Actions have consequences." I hung up before she could respond. Over the next few days, the fallout spread. They discovered that the car insurance, still listed under their joint business account, had been suspended due to a sudden and unexplained audit. I might have had a hand in that, leaning on a friend in the industry. The garage lockout was a more personal touch, a reminder that I still had a few cards left to play. The family chat exploded. My Aunt Linda, who had always been the quiet observer, finally snapped, calling my mom out for trying to publicly shame her own son. Uncle Mike added fuel to the fire, pointing out that if anyone needed a reality check, it was my parents. Amidst the chaos, my grandparents reached out. I'd always been close with them, the kind of bond that only grows when you spend long summers on their old farm, learning to drive an ancient tractor and listening to your grandfather's stories about the good old days. My grandmother's voice was soft but firm when she called me. "Jack, honey, your mother's been raising hell with the family, saying you've gone rogue. But I've heard what really happened. Don't let them bully you. You're doing the right thing." My grandfather, the quiet, steady type, didn't say much when he got on the line, just a low, gravelly, "Proud of you, son." Those few words, coming from him, meant more than 1,000 apologies from my parents ever could. As I hung up, I felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. I knew my parents wouldn't back down. I knew the storm was just beginning. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had my footing. And I had a few more moves planned. The calls from my parents tapered off after that first chaotic day, but I knew them too well to believe they'd back down quietly. I could picture my mom pacing the living room, her phone clutched tight in one hand, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the leather armrest as she plotted her next move. My dad, meanwhile, would be standing by the fireplace, swirling his wine like some brooding movie villain, trying to figure out where he lost control. It didn't take long for their retaliation to hit. I came home from work a few days later to find my front door wide open. My heart dropped. I rushed inside, my mind jumping to worst-case scenarios, but nothing was missing. Instead, everything was just moved. My books, usually lined up neatly on my shelves, were stacked haphazardly. The framed photos on my mantel were turned backward. My desk drawers were pulled out, contents dumped onto the floor like someone had been searching for something. I found my kitchen cabinets open, my plates and cups stacked in a careless pile on the counter. But it was the note on my refrigerator that made my blood run cold. Family takes care of each other. You'll come around. No signature, but I didn't need one. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief, and dialed my parents. My mom picked up on the second ring, her voice calm, almost amused. "Jack, honey," she said, drawing out each word. "I see you've been home." I felt my jaw tighten. "What the hell did you do to my place?" "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she replied, sounding almost bored. "It's just a reminder. You're still part of this family, whether you like it or not. You can't just cut us off without consequence." I closed my eyes, leaning against the wall, forcing myself to breathe. I wanted to scream at her, to let years of pent-up frustration pour out, but I knew better. She thrived on that kind of chaos. "Breaking into my house isn't family," I said, my voice low, barely controlled. "It's a crime." She let out a small, mocking laugh. "Don't be so dramatic, Jack. We just needed to remind you where you come from." I hung up, my mind racing. She had crossed a line, a big one. I spent the next few hours putting my place back in order, trying to calm my nerves, but the rage sat heavy in my chest, a cold, sharp weight that refused to settle. Then, just as I was about to call it a night, my doorbell rang. I froze, my mind immediately jumping to the worst. But when I opened the door, it wasn't my parents standing there. It was Ethan. He looked pale, his eyes darting nervously as he stepped inside, glancing over his shoulder like he expected someone to follow him. "Jack, I need to talk to you," he said quickly, his voice shaky. "Mom and Dad, they're planning something else. Something worse." I closed the door behind him, my mind spinning. I'd been ready for a fight, but this was starting to feel like a war. Ethan stood in my living room, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie, eyes flicking nervously around like he was expecting my parents to burst in at any moment. I motioned for him to sit, but he just leaned against the arm of my couch, his foot tapping anxiously on the hardwood floor. "They've lost it, Jack," he said, his voice low, words tumbling out like he'd been holding them in for too long. "Mom's been on a warpath since Thanksgiving. She's talking about cutting you off completely. She even mentioned selling Grandma's old house, the one she promised you." My stomach tightened. That house wasn't just a piece of property. It was where I'd spent my childhood summers, where my grandparents had taught me about hard work and loyalty, where I'd first learned to drive, hands shaking as my grandfather calmly coached me from the passenger seat. It was supposed to be my inheritance, a piece of our family's history. I took a slow breath, trying to steady myself. "Why tell me this, Ethan? You're not exactly on their hit list." He looked down, his shoulders slumping. "Because this isn't right. You've done so much for them, for all of us. You paid your way through college, never asked for anything, and now they're trying to turn you into the villain because you set a boundary." I felt a flicker of something like pride, mixed with a deep, simmering anger. I hadn't expected Ethan to take my side, not after the way our parents had pitted us against each other. "What else did they say?" I asked, my voice tight. Ethan hesitated, rubbing his hands together, clearly struggling with whatever came next. "They've been talking about pulling you back into the family business, whether you like it or not. Mom said if you won't play ball, they'll make sure you don't have a choice. She even talked about cutting off your business contacts, leveraging their connections to freeze you out." I felt my pulse spike. This was more than just a family spat. This was a full-scale assault. "They're really that desperate?" I asked, my voice tinged with disbelief. Ethan met my eyes, a mix of guilt and fear flashing across his face. "They don't see it as desperate. They see it as teaching you a lesson. They think you're being ungrateful, that you owe them for raising you." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. The audacity. After everything I'd done to stand on my own 2 feet, they still saw me as a piece on their chessboard, something to be controlled and manipulated. Ethan's eyes dropped to the floor again, his foot still tapping. "I just thought you should know. I don't want to be part of this. I didn't ask for the car, and I definitely didn't ask to be used as a pawn in their games. I reached out, clapping him on the shoulder. I know, man. I appreciate you telling me. He gave me a small, shaky nod before heading for the door. Just before he stepped out, he paused, turning back to look at me. Jack, just be careful. They're not playing fair anymore. As the door closed behind him, I sank into my couch, the weight of his words settling over me. I'd underestimated just how far my parents were willing to go. I thought the garage stunt and the house break-in were desperate moves, but this was something else entirely. If they wanted to play dirty, fine. I could do the same. I picked up my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number from my lawyer. It was time to take the gloves off. I spent the next few days preparing, moving like a man possessed. If my parents wanted a war, I'd give them one, but on my terms. They thought they could bully me into submission, corner me into playing the obedient son again, but they had no idea how far I was willing to go to protect the life I'd built. First, I locked down my business. I reached out to my key clients, quietly moving contracts and sensitive information to a separate, untouchable LLC I'd set up years ago for just this kind of emergency. I cut my parents out of every professional connection they might have tried to poison, severing ties before they even had the chance to make their move. Next, I turned my attention to the family business, the source of their financial power. My father had always been the face, but it was my grandfather who had truly built it, brick by brick, decades before my parents had even entered the picture. What my mother had conveniently forgotten in her fury was that my grandfather had never really trusted anyone but me to manage the finances. I met with my grandfather at his favorite diner, the one with cracked vinyl seats and greasy bacon that he swore kept his heart strong. He was already waiting, a cup of black coffee in his hand, his sharp eyes tracking me as I slid into the booth across from him. "Jack," he said, his voice low and rough from years of chain smoking. "I hear your mother's stirring up trouble." I nodded, not bothering to sugarcoat it. "She broke into my house, messed with my things, and now she's talking about cutting me out of the family business entirely. She's even threatening to sell your old house, the one you promised me." He sighed, his leathery hands tightening around his mug. "I figured it'd come to this. She's always been a bit too controlling for her own good." I leaned in, my voice dropping. "Grandpa, I need your help. I can't let them take everything I've worked for. I won't let them turn me into a pawn in their games." He leaned back, studying me for a long moment, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening as a small, approving smile crept onto his face. "I was wondering when you'd finally stand up to them. Took you long enough." We spent the next hour outlining a plan, his voice steady as he laid out the details. By the time we left the diner, I had the full support of the family patriarch behind me. My grandmother had already quietly transferred the deed to her old house into my name, cutting my parents out completely. Back in my car, I made a final call to my lawyer. I had him draft a restraining order, making it crystal clear that any further harassment from my parents would land them in court. The next morning, I sent the paperwork to their house. I could imagine my mom's face as she opened the thick envelope, her fingers trembling as she realized just how badly she'd miscalculated. Just as I set the envelope in my mailbox, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Ethan. "Thanks for standing up for yourself, Jack. I'm with you on this. I'll handle Mom and Dad." I leaned against my car, the cold morning air sharp in my lungs, a strange calm settling over me. My brother, the one person in this mess who had never once asked for a handout, had finally found his voice. It felt like the first real victory in this whole twisted game. I turned to head back inside, a small, satisfied smile pulling at my lips. My parents had played their hand, but they hadn't counted on me turning the entire table against them. It was almost over. It took a few days, but the fallout finally hit. My parents, who had always controlled our family's narrative, suddenly found themselves on the outside looking in. I hadn't heard from them directly since I sent the legal papers, but I heard the whispers through the family grapevine. My Aunt Linda told me my mother had been calling every relative, trying to rally support, but most of them had already made up their minds. Then, one morning, I got a text from Ethan. "Grandma and Grandpa want you to come by. It's important." The message was short, but I could feel the weight behind it. I pulled into my grandparents' long gravel driveway later that evening, the crunch of the stones under my tires somehow both comforting and ominous. Their old house, the one now in my name, loomed against the dimming sky, the windows glowing with warm, yellow light. It felt like driving back into my childhood, into a world that was both familiar and irrevocably changed. Inside, I found my grandparents in the living room, sitting close together on their well-worn couch. My grandfather had a stack of thick manila folders on the coffee table, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. My grandmother gave me a tight, knowing smile, her eyes a little glassy, her frail hands folded in her lap. Ethan sat nearby, his head down, fingers nervously tapping against his knee. My grandfather looked up as I entered, his sharp, gray eyes locking onto mine. He set the folder down, slowly pulling off his glasses. "Sit down, Jack." I took the chair across from them, the same creaky old armchair I used to curl up in as a kid, listening to my grandfather's stories about the family business and the sacrifices he'd made to build it. I leaned forward, my elbows resting on my knees, my heart beating a little faster than usual. "Jack," my grandmother started, her voice steady but tinged with a deep, unspoken sadness. "We've made some decisions. Hard ones." My grandfather cleared his throat, his hands clasped tightly together. "Your parents have forgotten what this family stands for. They've crossed lines I never thought they would, and I can't let them tear this family apart any further." He paused, his jaw tightening, the deep lines around his mouth growing more pronounced. "We're cutting them off. Completely." I blinked, the weight of his words hitting me like a punch to the chest. I had expected a confrontation, maybe a tough conversation about family loyalty, but this was something else. "They've lost sight of what's important," my grandmother continued, her voice growing a little stronger, a flicker of the fire I remembered from my childhood. "Family isn't about control. It's not about money or power. It's about trust, respect, and love. And they've broken that." My grandfather leaned forward, sliding the stack of folders toward me. "We've updated our wills. Everything we have, the house, the business shares, the land, it's all going to you and Ethan." I stared at the folders, my pulse pounding in my ears. This was more than just a gesture. This was a complete shift in the family's power structure. It meant that my parents, who had built their entire lives around controlling the family business, would be left with nothing but their pride. I felt a strange, heavy mix of relief and guilt, the kind that makes your chest feel tight and your stomach twist. "Grandpa, are you sure?" I managed, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. "They're still your children." His eyes hardened, the steel of a man who had built an empire from nothing, who had fought his way up from the bottom and never forgotten what it cost him. "They stopped acting like my children the day they turned on you. I can't change what they've become, but I can protect what I've built." Ethan shifted in his seat, finally looking up. "I told them this was coming. I warned them to back off, to respect your boundaries, but they didn't listen." I leaned back, running a hand through my hair, trying to process everything. It felt surreal, like the final act of a play I hadn't realized I was starring in. "We're also formally transferring the deed to this house into your name," my grandmother added, her hand tightening around my grandfather's. "It's yours now. It always was, in our hearts." The room fell quiet, the only sound the soft tick of the old grandfather clock in the corner, each second echoing the slow, deliberate closing of a long chapter. Finally, my grandfather let out a long, weary sigh, his shoulders sinking into the couch. "Don't let them drag you back into their games, Jack. Build your life. Make it your own." I stood, feeling a strange lightness, like a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had finally been lifted. I hugged them both, their frail frames still surprisingly strong as they pulled me close. As I walked back to my car, the cold night air sharp against my face, I felt something I hadn't in years: true freedom. The kind that comes not just from financial security, but from finally breaking the chains of expectation and guilt. I took a deep breath, the winter air filling my lungs, and smiled. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I could finally breathe.